The immigrants from Wuhan had the red carpet laid for them to return to the country in. I think our next speaker, Mahua Moitra, might have something to say about the carpet that was taken away from the feet of immigrants from Bengal, Kerala, and Bihar working in different parts of the country. Mahua Moitra.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always difficult, I think, being in public life in one of these platforms, because no matter who, each one seems to hate a different person, but always, almost always, everyone loves to hate a politician. So I think we always come in kind of, having to play extra defensive. But I hope that today I will actually steer clear of the politics of it and try and stick to what the real issue at hand is. I mean, we can start with whether Nehru or actually Babur or the marauding Mughals were to blame for COVID being brought into India. I could start with that, but I don't think it would take us anywhere. I think what this pandemic has shown all of us, especially those of us in public life, people like me, people like Dr. Sarkar, people like the Honorable Moderator, is that there is such a wide gap in our understanding of India and especially crisis in India, of how we react to crisis and how we are equipped to deal with crisis. The idea of a crisis for a rich man in India or a rich person or a poor person are two very different things. The idea of how we cope with a crisis is very different from a rich person and that for a poor person. But as far as any government is concerned, the primary duty of any elected government is to make sure that a crisis is mitigated almost equally for a rich person as for a poor person. It is not in the perspective of personal choice. The minute you're elected into government, you lose the personal perspective. No decision of yours has the, I would say, luxury of being applicable only to the rich or only to the poor. And the truth of this was, nowhere was it as stark as during this pandemic. We are talking about balancing lives and livelihoods, and that the government balance lives and livelihoods. But the truth is that this isn't really a fair trade-off, because for the rich, you may have the choice to stay at home and work at home. You have a choice to decide whether you put your life at risk by leaving the house, or whether you decide to cut down on the number of hours you work and work from home. For a poor person, life is livelihood, sirs, ladies and gentlemen. Life is livelihood. There is no police in the world that can stop a person from leaving their home if they have no food in their home, no money in their pocket, and nowhere to get essentials. There is no police in the world that could stop people from doing it. And there is no government that can stop it. So I think this trade-off between lives and livelihoods is almost a false binary, as Mr. Hegde put it. There is no choice for about, I would say, 75% of India. 94% of the workforce in India is in the informal sector. Contrary to what my esteemed friend on the other side pointed out, he said that we've done well. And people, they had the choice. When the migrants came back home, they had the choice of whether you chose to work in Manrega or to work in a large industry. People do not have that choice in India. 94% of India is in the informal sector. And opposed to China, where almost 56% of the Chinese working population are engaged in large factories employing 200 people or more, in India that figure is close to 5%. That's how large the disparity is. So the issue is, when you're faced with a crisis like the corona pandemic, what does any government do? I'm not debating whether the government should have gone into lockdown or not gone into lockdown. Perhaps that is a choice that was inevitable for any government globally, and lockdown on the face of it was the right thing to do. But a government which has the ability to mobilize lakhs of troops overnight surely had the ability to give clarity to the movement of migrant workers, 30 to 50 million people who were stuck in different cities. And that's where I think this government failed. Now we aren't here, no government is here to be rewarded on what we did right. That is what is needed to be done. That is the duty of every government. We cannot be applauded. No central government or state government can be applauded on I saved so many lives. That's what you're supposed to do. No one's going to give you a first prize for doing that. Let's get over these kind of ridiculous comparisons of had we not done this, this would have happened. Had India not locked down, then the death would have been more. The truth is we don't know. The question is 30% of India's workforce are made up of migrant workers. What the government did in the manner in which they did it was completely blind and callous to the plight of these workers. And I think that's where we failed completely to balance lives and livelihoods. When we're talking about, we had Mr. Basu on the other side talk about direct benefit transfers. Shall I give you one statistic? The direct benefit transfers that were handed out by this government till date are to the tune of 113,000 crores. This government took back from the same people exactly 113,000 crores by way of extra cess on gas and petrol. That's the end. We talk of how well India did. India was the single worst performing developing economy in 2020. Single worst performing economy. We spent 2% on social transfers compared to 20% by OECD countries and 6% in middle income countries. So there's a fourth trade-off again. Now, whose lives did you save? Whose lives did you actually save? When you talk of the number of deaths that we had deaths due to the disease, which were probably evenly split between the rich and the poor. I don't have the statistics on that. But we talk of the collateral damage, as President Bush so sort of clearly put it. When we talk of collateral damage, we had over 800 migrant deaths due to road accidents. How many people like you and me died due to road accidents because we happened to be walking on the road during the pandemic and a truck mowed us down? How many? Was it one? Was it two? So when you see that, when you think of 80 people dying on Shramik special deaths, suffocated, dehydrated, yes, the number is 80, it's not very much. But compare that to 0 for people like you and me. Did the government do a good job? 350 people died in other accidents relating to the railways during this time. This is data put out with the Indian Railways. How many people like you and me died? Did the government do a good job? So the point is not whether we balance lives and livelihoods. For the poor, lives are livelihoods. And when we planned the lockdown, when you announced the lockdown in the way that you did on the 24th of March, I think on the 24th of March, the number of people who were infected were about 360. The number of deaths was about 7. On the 8th of August 2020, 2.15 million people were infected. We were the third highest infection rate after UK and Brazil. And we had about 44,000 deaths, which was the 5th highest. So you can go into whether the government prevented X or Y. The truth is, we don't know. When Mr. Basu pointed out, the epidemiologist at Mr. Barack Obama's office, the President Obama's office, who said that 300 to 500 million people would be infected, he wasn't far from the truth. As of today, 11.2 million people have tested positive. All the surveys in Delhi, in Maharashtra, and all the COVID surveys show that the ratio of people who have gone undetected to the people who have tested positive is 50 to 1. So when you have 11.2 million people who have tested positive in RT-PCR tests and you multiply that number by 50, then 300 to 500 million people being infected is not very far off. It's not very far off. When we talk of the number of deaths, and we are saying we've only had 157,000 deaths, 1.57 million deaths, 1.57 lakh deaths. The issue is, again, when you look at the population of India, this is a disease that adversely affects an above 65 population. In India, as of the latest statistics available end of 2019, only 6.3% of the Indian population is above the age of 65. Only 6.3% of the Indian population, compared to about 21% of Europe, which is above the age of 65. So obviously, when you have a younger population, also due to the fact that we have poorer healthcare than anywhere else, then as Dr. Sarkar put it, then one of the, I would say, better fallouts out of that is that we have a lower mortality rate. That is not something that the government needs to be slapped on the back for. That has nothing to do with the government as such. It's just a result of worse healthcare and what our population, what our demographics look like. One of the other things that I would like to bring up is that when we're looking at this pandemic, there's the numbers, there's the statistics, but speaking as someone who's worked on the ground all throughout the pandemic in the constituency, and having to deal with 2 to 3 lakh people who came back to my district alone, getting off the trains, looking after them, I think the one thing that will stay with us is, as a nation, we have dehumanized our people. More than anything else, whether this government has failed, or whether this government has failed to, whether it's improved the economy, whether the economy is K-shaped or V-shaped, or whether, economic recovery is going to be 11% or 10%, I think what this pandemic has done has brought shame, the feeling of shame and humiliation in all of us, which will stay with us for a long time. This generation, people like us, didn't see partition. We didn't even see the Bangladesh war. We didn't see that absolute, abject desperation in people's eyes. I've never seen that till the pandemic. And I think the sight of people working, thousands of people working for hundreds of miles, just trying to reach home, with no social welfare, with absolutely no social safety net, 70 years after independence. Many years, 50 years after the Bangladesh war, 70 years after independence, is, I think, what has dehumanized us as a nation. And I think that is where the government has failed, both in terms of balancing lives and livelihoods, and frankly, it has failed India in its primary task, which is basically to provide the same level of human dignity to every single Indian. That is the task of every government, and I think that is what the government this time during the pandemic failed to do. It failed to provide the same standard of human dignity. The poor were completely disproportionately affected, whereas the rich and the middle classes were kept aside. And I think that's what we need to take away from this, that not only did they failed spectacularly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It gives me great pleasure to introduce and bring to the dais my professional colleague, Dr. Kunal Sarkar, to speak in favor of the motion.
When Telegraph extended his very gracious invitation for this debate, I was under the illusion that we would be indulging in free speech, till a report came out a few days ago suggesting that it won't be entirely free, as Freedom House UK tell us we are partially free. And I leave it to the offices of the chairperson and the Telegraph that I belong to the right part. Now there is something going around the air these days called sedition, which most North Indian channels interpret as sedation. And generally they don't know that unknowingly they are speaking the truth. But it is the presence of Mr. Sanjay Hegde that gives me tremendous confidence that should such a action takes place, there is Mr. Mitra in the front line, so please do take care of me if I fall over. There is one person, that one, Mr. Chairman, sir, that my dear friend should not have mentioned in the opening line of anything to do with COVID. It is like you starting a lecture on financial ethics by mentioning Nirav Modi, and that is the name of Tedros with COVID. It is under his callousness that 2 precious months were lost, that if not for the lone warring Chinese doctor Li Wenliang, that the news of COVID would not have broken out to the world. And it is under the very eyes of a corrupt and doctored World Health Organization that 2 precious months were lost in taking effective measure of the pandemic. Sanjay has already mentioned about the airports being open. Yes, No matter how triumphantly nationalistic you are, COVID, unlike the internet, jet engine and everything else, did not originate in India. Those of you who think, perish the thought. It did not. It is not quoted in Indian mythology. It happened somewhere else, and it had to be brought to our country. And in order to bring COVID to our country, it is not a pandemic that spread by physical movement. It is a pandemic that spread through flights. And as Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, every country in physical proximity of China had shut their gates down, way down in late December, early January. Ladies and gentlemen, we waited till the 20th of March. And in the last 7 days that the flights were open, something around 20 to 25 lakh passengers came in from Europe and United States at a time when Europe and United States were running an infectivity rate of around 20%, which meant that we invited in 5 lakh infections only in the last week through the main airports of Mumbai, Delhi. And look, in Bengal we are far-sighted. So 20 years ago, our forefathers took precautions that we have no international flights. We were all ready for the pandemic. Apart from the few cheap tours to Bangkok or what have you, we had stopped. We were all ready for the fight. But yet, migrant labors and all this introduced the infection to us. And look, even the poor Bengali was not spared. So that is the callousness that brought the infection into our country. And having done that, when Milan was burning, Paris was burning, London was fumbling, in about 24th of March, we decided to go in the lockdown. And when we entered the lockdown, ladies and gentlemen, we had a case count of around 600. About 10 to 11 people had died in India, and we went into the lockdown with the manifest interest that we have to flatten the curve. We are not talking about Hollywood beautiful babes over here. So we wanted to flatten the curve, and 68 days later, when we emerged from the lockdown, we had 2.5 lakh cases and 7,500 dead. And that is how the curve had expanded. It was looking alluring, but it was a wrong kind of curve that you don't want to look at, ladies and gentlemen. That is where the 68 days lockdown left this country with. The question is why? The question is simply because of the reason, first of all, somebody was under the impression, I don't know who it is, don't quote me for it, somebody was under the impression that this was a general election happening. So we had the entire 3 million square kilometers of India locked down monolithically at once. That is not possible. India is not going to behave as a homogeneous, contiguous entity because the coronavirus may not require a passport or a CAA or an NRC, but it requires time to travel. And this coronavirus came in through the west first, went to the north next, then to the south, and then very reluctantly through the east. So we had no idea what the chronology or the time frame spread of the virus is going to be. We had no granular data from the ground. We had impulsion, we had impulse, we had perceptions, we had bang utensils, 4 hours notice, come on, lockdown, chalega. That is the kind of spirit and knowledge in which the lockdown was maintained. And how did we go to implement this lockdown? The police, everybody worked brilliantly. But it was a law and order exercise. You had the bamboos, you had the thing, you had people being locked in the rooms, you were really, the only thing did not happen is that the corona-infected people were not deemed to be under trials. So apart from that, we had a stringent lockdown. But what was missing? When we contained people, we did not test them adequately. When we contained people, we very early in the game, we lost our enthusiasm for contact tracing. So what happened is, after all this barricading, restriction, containment was around, fair enough, we satisfied our physicality of the lockdown, but the epidemiological core of the problem was not addressed to, not in the least, ladies and gentlemen. And why did it happen? Harsh spoke about Team India. Yes, it was Team India, but it was like the football team representing India in cricket. Why was it? Answer me one question this evening. I have very little money. I can ask Harsh to give you a free flat. Who is India's chief epidemiologist? Answer me one question. Every civilized nation on the earth knows who is leading their epidemiology program. There is an entity, friends, in India called the Center for Disease Control, located in Pune. Perhaps the central government thought it was hostile territory. It's in Maharashtra. So perish the thought. I am going to hand over pandemic control to the ICMR, which is an august body of very peace-loving, quiet gentlemen and women who are generally engaged in research. It is a research organization. So how come by bypassing, circumventing the sole entity in India which was supposed to take control of pandemic management, it is handed over to a research organization? Because not that you have the right men there, but because you have the yes men there. And 1 month into the lockdown, ladies and gentlemen, I have the slide on my phone if any of you are interested. There was a meeting of a committee which was called the Empowered Committee. The committee was tremendously empowered but very ill-informed. And the committee put up on the wall a PowerPoint slide. Those of you who are interested, I have it over here. And that PowerPoint slide said, this is the chairman of the Empowered Committee speaking on 24th of April, guaranteeing everybody that there will not be a single RNA molecule left on India by 16th of May. This is the intellectual input that went into the formulation of the lockdown, that we thought by 16th of May it will be done and dusted. And why did this happen? Because this Empowered Committee was sequentially led by a biomedical person, then by a cardiologist, then by a pediatrician. There wasn't a single field qualified epidemiologist to be seen anywhere at a time when 15 out of the 20 leading epidemiologists of the world were Indians. Water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. This is the reason, ladies and gentlemen, that why you had a program which had all enthusiasm, which had all restriction, but if you look at the fundamentals of public health, we faltered. We were supposed to add capacity to healthcare. God Almighty, for somebody who's been starving for 73 years, how do you get marasmic Indian healthcare looking like, the abs of Salman Khan in 60 days' time? Not possible, ladies and gentlemen. And we did not lead because at the very maximum, not a single Indian state even used 50% of its capacity. We were separating hospitals. Bengal had 38,000 beds. We coped with 20,000. The rest, 19,000, were never used. India had 40,000 ventilators. The maximum record of the number of people ventilated at any single time did not exceed 10,000. And everybody came in. If you had a lathe machine in your workshop, everybody was in a 9 o'clock news manufacturing ventilators. I was praying that the last person not to manufacture ventilators should be the mobile phone companies, because if you had a ventilator drop out for a few seconds, the results will be rather severe, ladies and gentlemen. So thankfully, the mobile phone operators did not get into the queue for manufacturing ventilators. Everybody else did. I break another myth in front of you. I should not be sharing these secrets. saying that India is a young population, that's why we've done so well. Of course we are a young population. The birth rate of India has plateaued a decade earlier. So after your birth rate plateaus, if you continue to be a young population, it means you are a bad healthcare. It means you do not know how to keep the 60 plus alive. That is why you are a young population. So there are people going out painting the town red, saying that we are a young population, that's why we've had low mortality. We may have had relatively less mortality, but do take count of the fact that 65% of India's mortality is under 50 years of age. We have not lost octogenarians. We have lost, friends, people in the prime of their lives. What was COVID, friends? Was it an intrusion of a greedy humanity into the environment? What was COVID, friends? Was it the cynical behavior of some country with a crazy scientist? We do not know. But it has taken 102 years for the next respiratory pandemic to appear. I'm sure the next one may not take another 102 years. But whenever it comes, ladies and gentlemen, remember the countries of Southeast Asia, 5 countries added together do not have a mortality of 200. The countries which are nearest to China have had the best possible outcomes of COVID in terms of cases, disease, mortality, and economic preservation. So India had a lesson to learn. And if not for this time, in the words of my friend, Mr. Sanjay Hegde, when he says, for those people who are one meal away from the starvation, you need to absorb the lessons. You need to listen to the right men and not the yes men. There may be contrarian opinion. You have to have the courage of conviction to stand up to it. Yes, we did it. The question you should ask yourself this evening is that did you emerge from the pandemic because of the policies or in spite of the policies? The question you should feel pride or proud about is 1.5 crore of Calcutta, majority stayed indoors during Durga Puja. What US could not do during Thanksgiving, that Europe could not do during Christmas, Calcuttans did during Durga Puja. Feel proud of it, because you have done it. Each one of you have done it. Otherwise there would be beds lined up across 5 kilometers either side of the pavement. We owe it to the people of Dharavi, ladies and gentlemen. When the government had run away, the self-help groups of Dharavi came together. And when the country had given up on Dharavi, the people of Belgacia, the people of the slums of Delhi, the slums of Mumbai, they got together. So the government fumbled, but the people triumphed.
Kunal, you need to wind up.
I will, Sandeep, but let the lessons not wind up, because COVID has come to us with very sharp pointers. And if India has to be empowered and Atmanirbhar, then we have to have the Atma Vishwas to face up to facts as they stand and not to facts as we want it. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.